Welcome, friends. I want you to know a little bit about Vanessa before she speaks today. Vanessa Julye has devoted many years to a ministry of increasing Quaker awareness about how to change in order to be welcoming to all who come among us. She has led workshops, presented lectures, written articles, and co-written a book, all to help us see the problems that all Friends need to address. As part of the staff of Friends General Conference, she has facilitated participation in the White Privilege Conference, where all become a part of a forward-thinking community dedicated to equity, and white friends learn about white supremacy. She arranges times and spaces for friends of color to share their experiences. This allows isolated friends of color to be with others as part of a community. My experience is we need to listen carefully to the message she has given to share with us today. Your life may be changed as mine has been. Vanessa will speak out of waiting worship, and we will return to waiting worship when she is finished.
Thank you, Janice, for your introduction, especially since you were not given much advance notice. You are a faithful friend of mine and Friends General Conferences. Good afternoon, everyone. It is nice to have all of you here with us today. I also want to thank my friend and coworker Ruth Reber for the invitation to speak with you today at FGC's Changing Times Conference, an event that grew from the seeds of desire expressed by friends in gathering anew focus groups. Thank you, FGC, for providing an additional opportunity to share across yearly and monthly meetings. Next slide, please. I will begin our day with giving honor to the local tribe of this area of Turtle Island, the Lenni Lenape tribe of Pennsylvania, where I live. As some of you know, this is a practice that I have been doing for several years. It is my way of acknowledging that the land on which I live and work was stolen by William Penn and other European men from the Lenni Lenape tribe. In their Aboriginal language, Lenape means true men or original people. They are called the original people because many of the tribes of the Algonquin Indian tribes say the Lenape homeland was the original birthplace of the Algonquin Indians. So the Lenapes are referred to as their grandfather tribe by various other tribes. The Lenni Lenape tribe is made up of 3 groups called clans. These clans are the turtle, wolf, and turkey. They are a part of the Algonquin people of the Anishinaabe tribe of southern Canada and northern United States. The Lenni Lenape are matrilineal, which means that every member traces their descent through their mother's line and not their father's. The Lenni Lenape tribe, also referred to as the Delaware Indians, are caretakers of the land called Lenapehoking. This land expanded all the way from northern Delaware to southeastern New York and from the Atlantic Ocean to the forest in eastern Pennsylvania. They acquired the name Delaware Indians from English colonists in the Delaware Valley. The Europeans forcibly removed the majority of the Lenni Lenape tribe westward in the 1700s. Those who remained, fearing the persecutions suffered by their contemporary in the American Indian community, generally kept their ancestry a well-guarded secret. The colonization of the Lenni Lenape tribe and their removal from Lenapehoking is at the root of how the American colonies were born. I'm going to share with you their standard land acknowledgement written by the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation to honor the Lenni Lenape people and territory preceding events in Lenapehoking. Next slide, please. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanan that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Next slide, please. To get a better understanding for the destruction colonization caused for Native people, I would like for us to watch this slide of the map depicting the theft of Turtle Island's original indigenous homelands over the centuries from 1776 to the present. This slide is silent. We will sit in silence as we watch this clip and feel the loss of the indigenous population of Turtle Island. Go ahead. Next slide, please. I'm here today to acknowledge that many of our systems are supporting the oppression of people. We are living through a tumultuous time where we are experiencing a global pandemic, wars, globally extreme and historic wildfires, floods, snowstorms, increasingly intense and numerous tornadoes in areas that traditionally have not experienced them, global drought, and more frequent and severe global earthquakes. Our climate is changing more quickly than scientists expected. Our Earth is transitioning underneath our feet. Are we listening to her? I would say that the majority of us are not. We want our lives to return to what many of us called normal. Next slide, please. A normal that is based on a capitalistic system centered on material commodification, replication of extractive techniques as a form of economic development for European nations, and based on a system of assets with land and labor being the key commodities. A white, dominantly controlled structure designed to oppress by skewing the availability of resources in favor of white people. Colonization and capitalism are the root of our major global problems today. Racism and white supremacy has been established as our system of power. Next slide. White supremacy, racism, colonization, and capitalism are all systems being implemented internationally. These systems were created by European countries to build their economies and reserves. Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain all had a role in colonizing several continents, including Africa, the Caribbean, and Turtle Island. When I learned about history in school, it was something from which I was detached because it happened a long time ago before I was born, and it was not representative. The only thing I learned about African Americans was that we were enslaved and that the Civil War was fought to free us from enslavement. At that time, I did not know my indigenous ancestors. They remained hidden from me until I was an adult, when my cousin Anita Wills identified them through her research of our family. In actuality, my United Cherokee Indian Tribe of Virginia, Nanticoke, and Wicomico ancestors were physically present, represented in the faces, cultural practices, and beliefs of my family members, hidden in plain sight. Next slide. In school and through American culture, I learned Turtle Island was a vast, uninhabited land that was waiting to be exploited for its bountiful resources. The indigenous tribes of this land served as an obstruction to that goal, so needed to be contained and/or removed. What role have Friends had in the establishment of our white-centered system? How did we get here? It is important to understand the large role that religion has had in the foundation of the American empire. The church is at the root of colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy. It has been complicit in bringing Western civilization, quote unquote, to the rest of the world. For centuries, Christianity has been used to conquer, brutalize, control, and kill and convert the pagans to Christianity, obliterating other religious and cultural traditions. Christianity is at the root of Quakerism. Next slide. When in 1652, George Fox climbed Pendle Hill and saw a people in white raiment coming to the Lord, the vision signified that proclaiming Christ's power over sin would gather people to the kingdom. Fox's message focused on the inner light of the living Christ and who could speak truth directly to the individual soul. Fox believed that all people had the inner light for spiritual revelation, although for some it is extremely faint. This inner light, Fox reasoned, made it possible for humans to recognize God, understand and believe in the scriptures, and come to know and follow God through a fox that taught true worship was to devote oneself in silence directly to Christ to receive his grace and know him. He believed that the inner spirit always spoke in harmony with Jesus' teachings as recorded in the Bible. Fox criticized the Church of England and attacked its clergy. Early friends were arrested and imprisoned for their beliefs and religious practices. All during this time, Christian supremacy was present. It established a lens through which Fox and his followers saw and lived their lives. Next slide. Usually, I begin examining this foundational structure with the Crusades. Today, we are going to reach further back in history to the Roman Empire and Emperor Constantine. In an article in National Geographic, written by Kristen Baird-Rattini, they describe Constantine, who lived around AD 280 to 337, as the person who reigned over a major transition in the Roman Empire. He accepted Christianity and established an Eastern capital city that later bore his name, Constantinople, which marked his rule as a significant transformational point between ancient history and the Middle Ages. The outside Rome in AD 312 was a seminal moment for Constantine. He defeated a rival, gaining the mantle of Western Roman Emperor. However, more importantly, he experienced a revelation before the battle. Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, shared that Constantine and his forces saw a cross of light in the sky, along with the Greek words for "in this sign conquer." Then, later that night, Constantine dreamt. Christ reinforced the message. As a result, he marked the Christian symbol of the cross on his soldiers' shields. When Constantine triumphed at Milvian Bridge, he attributed the victory to the God of the Christians. Next slide. Next slide. Now we advance to 1096 and the Crusades, the beginning of a series of religious wars to recapture the city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land for Christendom, initiated by Pope Urban II against Islamic rule. There were 8 major crusade expeditions that occurred between 1096 and 1291. During these wars, Muslim Moors were considered less human than the Christian soldiers. The military expeditions undertaken by European Christians in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries to recover the Holy Land from Muslims provided a template for warfare in other areas that also also interested the Latin Church. Next slide. Continuing with his examination, we come to the 15th century, where the doctrine of discovery was established. It was a series of papal bulls giving European Christian colonizers the right to take land and other resources, and to convert or kill non-Christian inhabitants. There were 3 papal bulls that occurred between 1452 and 1493. They supported the credence that non-Christians were considered enemies of the Catholic faith, and as such, less than human. Pope Nicholas directed King Alfonso to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, and to take all their possessions and property. The doctrine of discovery is the seed of white supremacy and capitalism. It gave Europeans the right to colonize both Africa, the Caribbean, and Turtle Island, implementing the commodification of land and people, making them all property through state-sanctioned structural violence. Next slide. Friends used the doctrine of discovery to build their empire. Quakers have been instrumental in the colonization of Africa, Barbados, and Turtle Island. Friends used the doctrine of discovery to participate in the colonization of Barbados, where they appropriated land for their sugar plantations. Next slide. In her book, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, Catherine Gerbner states that the largest community of Quakers outside of the British Islands was in the slave and sugar-rich island of Barbados. Next slide. According to Gerbner, Anne Austin and Mary Fisher were the first Quaker missionaries to arrive in Barbados in 1655. They attracted planters, merchants, and craftspeople to join them in Barbados, where enslavement was accepted into these friends' convictions and practices. Next slide. Friends profited from the shipping industry that carried enslaved Africans from Africa to the Caribbean and Turtle Island. They invested their money in banks and insurance companies, supporting ships that transported enslaved Africans as cargo to the Caribbean and Turtle Island. Quakers also profited from being shipbuilders, owners, captains, traders, and financiers. There was a broad range of merchants involved in this industry, from the blacksmiths and block makers who fitted the ships, the sail lofts and rope walks who prepared canvas and rigging. There were also the caulkers who scraped and sealed hulls, and finally the carpenters who built the shelving below deck where the enslaved Africans were shackled. Other merchants not directly involved with the ships provided products that were used in the purchase of enslaved Africans, such as rum made by distilleries sealed in barrels produced by coopers, candles, cloth, and iron bars produced by factories and foundries, as well as beef, flour, tobacco, and onions, all grown and provided by farmers. Every single one of them built their foundation of wealth in the United States of America on the enslavement of Africans. The 1845 Manifest Destiny philosophy which drove the westward and southern invasions, held that the United States of America was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy, Christianity, and capitalism throughout the North American continent, dispossessing indigenous tribes of their collective sovereign land, supporting European invaders' sense of entitlement and practice of accumulating wealth from stolen people on stolen land. It was believed to be both justified and inevitable. Next slide. There was the sense that white people were God's chosen instruments to civilize the U.S. and the world, according to Robert P. Jones, author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. This policy grew out of and was based on that doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery continues to manifest itself in the lives of indigenous people today. Next slide. In 2004, the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma and Anadarko filed a lawsuit against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This Delaware Nation based its lawsuit on the doctrine of discovery and the royal charter that King Charles II of England issued to William Penn in 1681. In the preamble of Penn's charter, King Charles II speaks of the charter's purpose and Penn's alleged intentions, which were to enlarge our English empire, to provide useful goods, and to civilize and Christianize the savage native. That charter gave William Penn sovereignty over land that had not yet been colonized and dominated by Christendom. Next slide. Some of you may know that William Penn's sons, John, Thomas, and Richard, illegally expanded their father's territory through what is referred to as the Walking Purchase. The Walking Purchase expanded Penn's original colony by tricking the Lenni Lenape into giving up a large portion of their territory by creating fraudulent documents which allowed them to legally steal a portion of the Lenape Nation's land. This 2004 court case concerned those fraudulent documents, and though the court recognized in its ruling the illegitimacy and fraudulency of the Walking Purchase, they ruled that the indigenous tribes did not have any right to the land in the first place. Indigenous peoples, or quote-unquote savage native, had the legal right to occupy land, but no right to own it. Also, in 2005, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion in City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, which cited the landmark 1823 decision. The ruling held that the repurchase of tribal lands did not restore tribal sovereignty. Indigenous people, along with the World Council of Churches and several Friends meetings, continue to fight for the doctrine's revocation. Also, you can see the doctrine erected barriers, as you can see, between Europeans and people of color by calling some Christians human and non-Christians non-human, creating the legal, religious, political, medical, social, and economic ethical framework that justified white supremacy, establishing the devastating pattern of natural resource extraction, enslavement, forced labor, separating families, and genocide. These violent patterns of dehumanization created systems of oppression that were established and are maintained by fear and massacre. My ancestors endured the governmental removal from their ancestral lands, separation of children from their parents, enslavement, and cultural genocide through assimilation. Next slide. What are the roots of African descendants' experiences within Quakerism in the Caribbean and the United States of America? As I stated earlier, Friends owned, sold, traded, and captured enslaved Africans. Quakers considered enslavement necessary for their economic development. Friends established regular meetings for worship for people of African descent for only those who they enslaved in 1675 in the West Indies after George Fox's visit to the island. Africans and people of African descent were not allowed to become members of the Religious Society of Friends until 1784. Worship for African descendants took place in separate meeting houses, or if they were invited to worship in a meeting house with people of European descent, they were placed in segregated sections of the back or balcony during the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States of America. Friends were good about donating money and their time to establish schools for people of African descent. Next slide. However, for the most part, we're hesitant to admit children of African American descent into Quaker schools. This is expressed in the words of Samuel Ringgold Ward, who escaped on the Underground Railroad to become an abolitionist. Ward stated, "The Quakers will give us good advice. They will aid in giving us a partial education, but never in a Quaker school beside their own children. Whatever they do for us savors of pity and is done at arm's length." Through our core belief of continuing revelation, changes have occurred within the Religious Society of Friends since the 17th century. It was not until the middle of the 20th century that Friends regularly admitted students that were not of European descent in the majority of their schools on the East Coast. Now, people of African descent can become members of Friends meetings. We can sit wherever we choose in meeting houses, and our children are educated in Quaker schools alongside white children. However, barriers remain in Friends communities. Next slide. Robert P. Jones, in his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, talks about a foundational Christian structure practiced among Friends. It would not be unusual for white slave owners to bring slave people to church with them on Sunday mornings. Whites would sit in the front, and enslaved people would sit in the back. That context certainly shapes the way Christian theology and practices form. You're not going to preach a lot of liberation, freedom, and equality from the pulpit. You're going to preach more about obedience to the master and fulfilling your roles, those kinds of things. I think that fundamentally distorted American white Christianity from the beginning. This Christian practice generated barriers invisible to many and thus more difficult for them to see. These barriers are the system of white supremacy that provides greater access to power and resources for people of European descent. The system that tells us this behavior is normal, encouraging us to support it by being complicit and not question the patterns of how we live our daily lives. Next slide. Jones states, "There's this tension between doing nothing to upset anyone, which is what white churches have often done, and having the skill and leadership to lead people on a journey. Christianity is supposed to be a journey, and it's not supposed to be a comfortable journey. Christian life is supposed to be a challenge. Part of that challenge is how we've let our conceptions of race and racism seep into our theology and infect it." He also says, "We've done damage to our own faith by allowing white supremacy to seep into it and be a presupposition of the kinds of theology and practices that can be developed." Gerbner talks about the Friends who colonized Barbados' need for labor to make money from their sugar plantations. Earlier, I stated that there was a large Quaker presence on Barbados. Thousands of Friends inhabited the island. Next slide. In the 1670s, it was called Nursery of Truth because it was so filled with Quakers. 80% of those Quakers in Barbados owned enslaved Africans. In 1671, George Fox traveled to the island where he urged Quakers to consider manumission, but he did not call for an end to the practice of enslavement. Fox commended Friends to worship with the enslaved people in their households and to introduce them to Quakerism. When Pennsylvania was founded in 1682, William Penn and others used their Quaker connections in Barbados to purchase enslaved Africans. As Pennsylvania's social and economic structure developed, ties with the West Indies and other trade channels flourished. The trade with Barbados was a source of pride and a symbol of prosperity for many English Quakers, who considered enslavement to be necessary for economic development. Also, colonists from Barbados relocated their wealth, enslaved Africans, and pro-enslavement ideologies to William Penn's new American colony when they settled in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Gerbner reminds us that whiteness was created in order to legalize and justify inequality. She further states that this history invites us to think about what it really means to combat oppression. This also means confronting the uncomfortable aspects of Quaker history. When we relegate the blame for slavery and oppression to people in the South, for example, we are actively erasing Quaker complicity in and support for enslavement, not only in Barbados, but also in Philadelphia and elsewhere in the North. This is an uncomfortable past, but it's a past that needs to be brought into the light. Looking carefully at this Quaker past can teach us a lesson about social justice. It shows us that it's not enough to be radical. We also have to be vigilantly aware of history and the complexities of inequality. It's not enough to have good intentions. We must be critically engaged with the past to understand the influence it continues to exert in the present. How has white supremacy and privilege been present in European American friends' relationships with education and African Americans? Next slide. In the research for our book, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice, my co-author Donna McDaniel and I found that as with meetings for worship, Friends established separate schools for African Americans. Next slide. Quakers are known for the schools they opened and supported for freedmen both before and after the Civil War. Anthony Benezet devoted much of his life to educating children and adults in Philadelphia's African American community. In 1750, he began teaching African American adults at night in his home. Cheyney State University, now a state-run university located in Cheyney, Pennsylvania, was established by Friends in 1837 as the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, PA. After the Civil War, Quakers established many schools for the emancipated enslaved Africans. These too were segregated. Many Quaker women devoted their time to voluntarily teach in the freedmen schools, despite the danger that this work presented to their lives. White Southerners, angry at the use of federal funds for African American education, reacted violently as well. Black schools were burned, teachers were publicly ridiculed, whipped, run out of town, and hanged. Sometimes these women were called gentle invaders. Friends were good about donating money and their time to establish schools for people of African descent. However, for the most part, as you heard stated earlier by Samuel Ringgold Ward, were hesitant to admit children of African American descent into Quaker schools. Next slide. It was not until the middle of the 20th century that Friends admitted students that were not of European descent in the majority of their schools on the East Coast. Key figures in the desegregation of Friends schools spell out quite clearly the reasons they objected to admitting African American students. These objections were felt on all levels of education, from elementary school, kindergarten through trade school, 12 schools, and colleges. By the early 1930s, even as its Race Relations Committee sponsored conferences on how to arouse Friends to a deep sense of responsibility regarding the racial situation, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting was not prepared to integrate each boarding school under its care, Westtown School or George School. Quaker school integration was minimal before the Second World War. In spite of their pioneer efforts in Negro education, Friends had not carried their doctrine of race equality to its logical conclusion. European American Quaker Howard Brinton wrote in 1940, Friends have generally had special schools for whites and Negroes. Next slide. African Americans admitted to Quaker schools found themselves at the edge of the community, often experiencing blatant racism. Opening schools to students and teachers of African descent prompted many questions. The dynamics and the difficulties were not unique to any one school. It did not take long for educators to understand that enrolling a few students of color simply revealed the importance of having more than a few students and the need for faculty of color and for a curriculum, in fact, a school culture that was not Eurocentric. Few suspected how the simple act of welcoming African American students would end up requiring everyone and everything in the school to be examined and re-examined through several lenses. Next slide. Recently, I gave a presentation at Sandy Spring Friends School, where I talked about my experience of isolation, absorbing and combating white supremacy as a student in a Quaker school. I remember feeling it was too much for the school to expect me to do my homework, be on a sports team, participate in an activity, and live on campus. I participated in the Black Student Union. However, I still felt like an outsider. Next slide. All during my childhood, my parents taught me that I was important. They told me that I was as bright and talented as anyone else, that I could be whatever I wanted if I worked hard enough. Sometimes I actually believed them. There were moments when I felt that my brown skin, brown eyes, round face, and black kinky hair were not barriers. It was wonderful being seen for who I was, the person inside me. Then suddenly my world would shatter when I was called the N-word or told I was not invited to a party because there already was one person of African descent coming, and if there were too many of us, we would take over and play our music. There it was, reality. Even in a place I considered it a safe community, I could not escape society and its labels. One of the gifts this experience and my parents gave me was the strength and opportunity to face people's prejudices and make them aware of and accountable for them. Next slide. Despite my experiences of racism at a friend's school, I sent my son Kai to 2 Quaker schools for him to receive the strong academic base both my brother and I had. As a parent, I had to fight the administration constantly for the labels it wanted to assign my son. I had the advantage of experience, which I was able to use to support Kai. Next slide. Years later, while our family was sitting around after sharing a holiday meal, I listened as my son and nephews, who also attended friend schools, shared their experiences. My heart sank as they talked, hearing them exchange their experiences of the racial incidents they had endured in their Quaker schools decades apart. My brother Kent and I graduated, he in 1980 and me in 1978. Kai graduated in 2003 and my nephew Hadley in 2022. Why was this happening? So now we circle back to the beginning of my presentation today. White supremacy is rooted in our society, religion, and education. Generation after generation, we are taught and passed down the practice of white supremacy. Next slide. Resmaa Menakem, some of you know as the author of My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, is also a healer, master coach, and trauma specialist, talked of the importance of developing and living an embodied anti-racist culture. Over centuries, we have built structures of transaction that are extractive and focused on production using the stolen indigenous land and stolen labor of people of color and poor people of European descent. Whiteness had to be deemed the supreme standard of humanness, making non-white bodies deviant to maintain the system. Whiteness as standard, with white comfort being our highest priority, a goal that is centered and recentered, requiring the white community to organize around silence, complicity, conformity, and niceness for the survival of white supremacy. He emphasized the harm that these structures are having on all of us, the importance of understanding how much trauma we are holding in our bodies, and the use of somatic processes in addressing the trauma. They are causing pervasive and persistent trauma, stress disorder, from which many of us want to be healed. However, healing is not possible until we disrupt the white supremacist system and build structures of trust. This will be slow and painful work. Healing is earned as you work, doing things and make different choices. Slide. For us to begin this journey of work for justice, it will be important for us to know and understand our own individual cultural heritage. We also need to have an honest understanding of how our ancestors contributed to this world and the structure of white supremacy, how we continue to maintain vestiges of these structures in our behaviors today. It is only possible to change a system once you have a clear understanding of how it operates. Acknowledging the pain and celebrating the accomplishments would help us be able to transform members of the Religious Society of Friends and inevitably the inhabitants of the world into peaceful human beings. Why am I sharing all of this history about Christianity, white supremacy, and some of my family's experiences in Quaker schools? I want you to hear and understand the role they have together built this white supremacist system. Next slide. As Quakers, our religion has had a role in implementing and upholding white supremacy. We need to hear that we have a problem, understand our role in creating the problem, and work to eliminate white supremacy. We also need to know that it has taken centuries to build the system so that we will not get rid of it overnight. White and Christian supremacy are systems. They are more than isolated and episodic incidents. White supremacy is intentionally built into our cultural, political, medical, legal, and educational systems. White supremacy is like oxygen. It surrounds us constantly, gives and sustains our lives. When you push it out, it finds its way back in through cracks, open windows, or doors. We can train ourselves to survive on less oxygen. It requires awareness and practice to acclimatize ourselves. When I was in the mountains of Peru, I was in a high altitude area which taxed my body. I had to slow down my pace of life, walk slower, take breaks, and sometimes naps until my body became accustomed to functioning on less oxygen, which inevitably it did. Our bodies and lifestyle can sustain ourselves in an embodied anti-racist culture. As we push against this racist system, it will push back. Next slide. The role of the system is to maintain itself, which it has done successfully for centuries. Many generations of my family have been fighting the system just to survive for 500 years. Next slide. As Resmaa Menakem says in his book, The Quaking of America, an embodied guide to navigating our nation's upheaval and racial reckoning, which I recommend all of you read, commit yourself and your efforts will cost you time, effort, comfort, and repeated failure. They might also cost you some relationships, money, your current self-image, your social position, or even your job. Don't try to figure out a way to avoid this cost. There isn't one. He goes on to say that you will be doing this for the rest of your life. Menakem also says to form alliance with other trustworthy people and groups. Try out some things and evaluate the results. Keep doing what works and learn from what doesn't. Make the most of the skills, relationships, and opportunities and peril as they unfold. Instead of following a playbook, you, along with many others, will write it and live into it. Next slide. As I have shared many times, awareness of white supremacy is not static. It is a process of continuing revelation. We all are someplace in this process, and everyone benefits when we grow. Center voices from the global majority and lived experience. Decolonize one's mind from accepting whiteness and Christianity as part of normalcy. Co-create alternative paths for acceptance, reflections, and actions. Move beyond diversity and inclusion to racial representation. Create alternative power structures, practice, and accountability. Next slide. We will need to lean into our testimonies of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, which I alter into equity, and stewardship. As our meetings feel like a soupy mess during our process of examining our structures, determining which ones to hold us up and which ones no longer serve us because they hold us back from co-creating our new structures. This process may take longer than expected for us to emerge, but when we do, we will be a stronger religious society of friends for doing that messy work of transformation together. Let us change our pattern of relating with one another to one that honors freedom, equity, integrity, and peace. Next slide. Speak to that of God in each person and honor our mutual humanity. The legacy of white supremacy is within all of us, and it is going to take all of us working together to remove the barrier it has constructed and preserves. Next slide. As descendants of the Religious Society of Friends and citizens of the United States of America, whether by blood or conviction, we are responsible for repairing the harm that this religious society implemented through our role in rooting our religion in colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy. It is time for us to have the vision to see things differently. Next slide. Be open to listening in new ways and understanding things outside of the context of white culture. Your goal should prioritize flexibility, steps outside of our white cultural boundaries. Test ourselves constantly to see how flexible we truly are. When you feel white fragility surfacing, notice it, let it pass through you, and take the risk of making a different choice. Instead of defending your intention, apologize. Let go of your defensiveness and focus on how your actions have impacted others, regardless of how good your intentions were. Next slide. We need to be accountable for the heritage of Quakerism. It is time for the Religious Society friends to openly share the truth about how we acquired our resources, which help maintain the oppressive systems and structure established to acquire and uphold Quakerism. It is time for us to provide restitution, repair, and justice for the spiritual, cultural, and economic harm perpetuated by Friends. We must do this as an individual, group, and organizational structure. Next slide. There are some Friends meetings and organizations that are working on restitution, repair, and justice by examining their practices and policies which are resulting in restorative action through economic redistribution and reparations. The work, although messy and painful, is being transformative. Friends know that change will not happen if we continue to make the same white-centric choices. All of the information I'm going to share with you about a FGC is available on our website, which you see posted now on your screen. Next slide. In October 2016, the governing body of Friends General Conference approved an institutional assessment on systemic racism to identify and address structural oppression within FGC as an institution and among FGC affiliated monthly and yearly meetings. In 2017, FGC retained Crossroads and contracted with us to train and work with FGC over a year to conduct our institutional assessment. Our report was completed and published in 2018. Our recommendations are arranged in 3 sections, 2 minutes that were presented for Central Committee's, our governing body, approval at its October 2018 meeting. Requests regarding the organizational structure for Friends engaged in that discernment. Advice for the proposed anti-racist transformation implementation group, describing ways forward to become an anti-racist organization. Some of the recommendations have been implemented, while others have yet to be addressed. Next slide. Friends General Conference established the query, how does this decision support FGC in its goal to transform into an actively anti-racist faith community? The organization is being more consistent with using this query to question decisions made by its employees, committees, and board. Next slide. FGC also established 2 funds. The Baird Rustin Fund is to support people of color's travel costs to FGC sponsored meetings and other activities, while the Mahala Ashley Dickerson Fund is intended to provide broad support for anti-racism work, including defraying the cost of people of color's registration fees for FGC-sponsored meetings and other activities, as well as supporting program development and staffing. Next slide. FGC has a racial wounding process that came out of a need to provide people of color avenues for support and healing at FGC-sponsored events when racial harm occurs. Friends of color are invited to fill out a racial wounding reporting form to request assistance from the committee. The committee's primary priority is to walk with and tend to the needs and healings of the person affected by racial wounding. The process is intended to ensure that friends of color have a way to address a racial wounding in whatever manner supports the greatest healing for them. The process also allows us to document racial harm in our community. You will find the report form on our website. FGC's Institutional Assessment Implementation Committee has 2 calls to action that we would like for you to share with both your monthly and yearly meetings. Next slide. The first is in 2023, 5 years after the original institutional assessment, FGC decided to track our progress towards becoming a fully anti-racist organization. We are currently seeking feedback from friends regarding their experience at Friends General Conference affiliated events and meetings to inform our new report. Next slide. The second is a request from IAIC's Demographic Data Subcommittee, which aims to collect demographic data from yearly meetings and directly affiliated monthly meetings to get a clearer sense of where Friends of Color worship. Next slide. This information will help us to better shape FGC's priorities and program offerings. We even have a sample survey form created by a member of the committee who used it in their monthly meeting. I want to assure you that FGC is not looking for information from individuals. We are hoping that monthly meetings will collect this general data about their members and attenders, race, ethnicity, age range, and gender identity, share it with our yearly meetings, who we hope will then share it with us. Many meetings gather statistics about our membership using a colorblind practice. Currently, it is assumed that all members are of European descent when there is not an option for me to record my non-European identity. I would like to be able to give a person an answer other than I don't know when I'm asked, how many people of color are in your meeting? Or how many people of color are in the Religious Society of Friends? Now all I can say is Friends do not gather that type of information for our membership, keeping me and other friends of color invisible in our meeting statistics. Next slide. So I want to ask you to support the Demographic Data Committee by urging your monthly and yearly meeting to cooperate with demographic data collection. Please have your yearly meeting submit their information to FGC. Talking with members of your meeting about the demographic data collection and its importance for anti-racism efforts is also important. Worshiping around the importance of knowing one another, not erasing Quakers of color and those most marginalized among us, and embracing the transparency that this survey offers. Next slide. The final change I would like to talk to you about today is a coalition of 6 Quaker organizations and friends who are working together to accelerate the movement for and capacity to create racial justice among and beyond Friends through the creation of the Quakers Uprooting Racism Community of Practice program and a group of racial justice change makers learning and experimenting with actions together. The Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism Steering Committee is made up of representatives of these organizations: the American Friends Service Committee, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Friends Committee on Education, Friends General Conference, Pendle Hill, and the Quaker Voluntary Service. Next weekend, our second cohort will gather for their opening retreat at Pendle Hill. Next slide. You can get involved with this initiative by providing financial support. We are accepting donations through our website, FGC's website, our mailing a check to our P.O. box. Make sure to designate this gift to Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, or QCUR. Reading and sharing QCUR's statement on racial wounding is another way, and racial justice in Quaker communities is another way to get engaged. And finally, joining the Racial Justice Quarterly newsletter. Additional information about all of these programs can be found on FGC's website. Next slide. Now we're going to do something new. I'm going to ask you a question which you will answer in Mentimeter. When I access Mentimeter on Zoom, you will get a pop-up which you will need to agree to join to participate in the survey. The question is, did you know about these FGC programs previously? You will only be able to give one response. You should be able to respond now. I see that some of you have seem to be having difficulty in responding directly in Zoom. You can also go to menti.com and use the code that's up at the top there, 49940463. And hopefully you can join in responding there, either by using your smartphone or using another screen on your computer. I'm going to give you one more minute to submit your response. Now we will move on to our second question in Mentimeter. If your monthly, quarterly, yearly meeting or organization is working on restitution, repair, and justice, examining your practices and policies, which is resulting in restorative action through economic redistribution and reparations, please let us know that by telling us about it through Mentimeter. If not, you can tell us that also. And so now we'll go to that next screen. And I'll give you a few moments to respond here as well.
if friends are having trouble accessing the Menti in Zoom itself, you can go to menti.com and enter in the code. Vanessa, can you repeat the code one more time?
Yes, it's 49940463.
Thank you.
I'll give you a few more moments and then I'm going to close this Mentimeter. Okay, I'm going to end the Mentimeter and so that Nova can put the slideshow back up. And it's hard because people keep responding, and thank you for that. This is wonderful. I appreciate all of your responses. Thank you. Our work has been messy, difficult, and frustrating. Friends General Conference has taken up the call to work for justice. We are using some of our economic foundation of accumulated wealth, resources, and energy obtained from stolen land, stolen resources, and the exploitation of people's labor, recognize the harm that colonization continues to perpetuate, and develop systems for the relocation of some of that wealth. Next slide. I know that the Religious Society of Friends is the faith and trust to choose hope, to co-create transformed communities where everyone unconditionally works for equity and justice. We can transform our communities through creating and maintaining an embodied anti-racist culture that lives into continuing revelation, is not static, but grounded and continuously listening for truth. It will be a bumpy road, but one that is definitely worth traveling, one that will help break the cycle of generations of institutional oppression of members and attenders of Friends meetings. Next slide. Friends need to push against white supremacy's violent patterns of dehumanization, created systems of oppression that were established and are maintained by fear and massacre. It is time for us to embrace discomfort and stop prioritizing whiteness as standard, with white comfort being our highest priority, excuse me, a goal that is centered and recentered, requiring the white community to organize around silence, complicity, conformity, and niceness for the survival of white supremacy. Next slide. As I near the end of my presentation, I want to remind you of Jones's words. There's this tension between doing nothing to upset anyone, which is what white churches have often done, and having the skill and leadership to lead people on a journey. Christianity is supposed to be a journey, and it's not supposed to be a comfortable journey. Christian life is supposed to be a challenge. Part of that challenge is how we've let our conceptions of race and racism seep into our theology and infect it. He also said, we've done damage to our own faith by allowing white supremacy to seep into it and be a presupposition of the kinds of theology and practices that can be developed. Next slide. Now I want to end our time together with each of you writing down a task that you will do in the next week to support the transformation of the Religious Society of Friends. Once you have done that, we will return to worship. Thank you, everyone. I have appreciated being with you today and express gratitude for your cooperation with my first Zoom PowerPoint presentation using Mentimeter. So I'm going to present again for Mentimeter. And this is: write down a task that you will do in the next week to support the transformation of the Religious Society of Friends. And once again, if you're not able to do it through Zoom, you can go to menti.com and use the code 49940463.
Four 49940463 is the code. That's 49940463.